Welcome to the Psychedelic Passage Podcast. My name is Jimmy Wynn. I am your host this week. Thank you for joining us. I hope everybody is doing well. We are in full spring mode, so coming out of winter and moving into spring, and I'm personally feeling a level of liveliness, as a part of that, and I hope that all of you listening into this episode are doing just as well. I think we've had a couple of exciting episodes over the past several weeks. I'm particularly proud of our episodes with Dr. Felix Bly of Miraculix. For anybody who have listened in the past couple of weeks, have probably noticed how much I nerded out on those episodes. I love learning. And I certainly am not a person that pretends like they know everything. Although there are folks who regard me as somewhat of like a subject matter, expert around, psilocybin and psychedelics. And I just love just being in that student mentality, in that place of just like learning a lot of things that I wasn't aware of and didn't know, particularly around psilocybin mushrooms. And it makes sense, right? These mushrooms have been pretty much outlawed and banned for the past 70 or so years, maybe 60 or so years. And so it kind of makes sense that as we're having this resurgence of psychedelic interest, that there's going to be a whole new body of research and study. So I'm very, very excited about that. Taking some of the stuff that I learned from those two episodes, and then also comparing that in conjunction with a lot of the inquiries that we get from folks through our website psychedelicpassage.com and our support email, and the questions that come through our concierge team. I thought it'd be really good to follow up on a more like a logistical episode. We get a lot of questions around using mushrooms, the logistics around storing mushrooms, best ways to ingest, some of those things. And so I felt really called to take some of the scientific, me nerding out on the past couple of episodes and just kind of break it down to the everyday user, the everyday. I'm not saying using, psilocybin mushrooms every day unless you're, microdosing or something like that, but to the common user of psilocybin mushrooms. Now, it's with hope that you are, engaging in these substances in an intentional way, in a safe way. But also, I just hold a really strong conviction that you have your right on how to engage with psychedelics and substances and all of that. I'll put a little bit of a disclaimer out there to say that psilocybin containing mushrooms are still federally illegal. They are a Schedule 1 substance out there. There's some local municipalities, whether at the state level or city level or county level, that maybe have some decriminalization measures with where you might be located. Maybe you listening might be in an area where all of this is fully criminalized, and there's a lot of risk potential. And so the disclaimer is that everything that I'll be speaking about in this episode really, to me, comes from a harm reduction and harm prevention lens. I hold a belief that there are folks out there in possession of these substances. Here we're talking about, psilocybin containing, mushrooms. And it's important to me that if an individual, chooses to engage in the use of these substances, that they are using best practices and having some safety measures regarding dosage and storage, and that they're getting the right information so that you can engage in a pathway that makes sense for you in a safe way. I look back on the time that I spent in the legal cannabis industry, and what I realized is that there was just a lot of misinformation and lack of information that was floating around, cannabis when it first started to get legalized. So in 2009 in Colorado, the first medical or medicinal cannabis program came about, with recreational cannabis use being approved in 2014. And even in the past two episodes with Miraculix, you see me kind of use a comparison of that period of time with cannabis, and how that affects and influences, this period of time. And I see a lot of crossover and similarity. Psychedelics are now a little bit more acceptable in the mainstream. There's more conversation to be had, around psychedelics, but mostly around their therapeutic effect. I think that there is much less conversation around, actionable things like how to store this and how to, so on and so forth. So, what I share here is that I think an empowered journeyer is a very informed journeyer. And so, over the course of this episode, I'm going to be spending a little bit of time just to give you all my breakdown on the resources and things that I hope can help you to have a harm reduction lens around psilocybin mushrooms if you choose to possess and consume them. So, let's dive right in. So we often get questions around just the logistics. So, what strains to use, how to measure, best ways to ingest, storing, keeping fresh, are my mushrooms bad, so on and so forth. And so what I'll start with is just giving like a breakdown of the forms and formats of how people are probably receiving psilocybin containing mushrooms here, in I'll just use Colorado as an example, where the gifting of psilocybin containing mushrooms is legal per the Natural Medicine Health Act. So primarily you're going to see mushrooms coming in a whole intact, dried format. So this is likely somebody who has, cultivated, the mushroom and has gone through a harvesting and a drying process for that particular batch. So, the majority of what most folks are going to see out there is, ideally a whole intact dried mushroom. Now it's important that that drying process is done well. And I also just acknowledge that not everybody is going to be able to speak to, the cultivator or the person who, grew these mushrooms to get that information. Whereas it's a little bit different with cannabis, where you do want to hold a little bit of moisture content in there to keep, the buds and the nugs, fresh. However, with mushrooms, you want a really, really, dry product. I think to the degree that the mushrooms are also like delicately handled, I think is also important. And, we learned a couple things from, Felix, Dr. Bly from Miraculix in the past couple episodes around where the moment that you like bruise, a mushroom, it'll turn like purple, which is an effect of the psilocybin creating that. So you're gonna like lose out on a little bit of potency if you're mishandling, mushrooms, or handling them, too rough. So, in general, if you are seeking mushrooms in a dried format, you wanna, make sure that they're whole, intact mushrooms, stems and caps. And you can generally tell if the mushroom products that you have, how they've been handled. I think other ways that folks are seeing, mushroom products come about, oftentimes you'll maybe see those in like a powderized format, put into gel capsules, probably weighed out to a specific, amount. This is typically for microdosing products and, things like that. And then oftentimes, you might see like a mushroom chocolate as well, or you may see like a mushroom gummy. I'm seeing those kind of floating around as well. I wouldn't be surprised if somewhere down the road there's a mushroom drink or some other type of, a drinkable product out there. And so I wouldn't be surprised if some point like mushroom tinctures start to, hit the landscape of like what's available out there, for folks. So, one thing that I'll share is that the emergence of, new products is gonna be well on its way. I'll just pause really quickly to say that for folks who may feel like they want a little bit more of like a primer or baseline, information to all of this, there's been a resource that's been around for a really, really long time called Erowid.org. That's spelled EROWID.org. And within that, there's actually what they call like a mushroom vault, where they have a lot of supporting information around, studies of potency to, strain breakdowns and suggestions. I think that the Reddit community is pretty lively as it relates to, some of this information as well. So I just wanted to point out that information. And going back to receiving different types of, products, I think that those products are formulated in different ways. Like if you are going to be getting, let's say, a mushroom chocolate, and they say that there's, 4 grams equivalent of, psilocybin containing mushrooms in there, it would be interesting to know if they use like whole dried mushrooms that they powdered down and added into their recipe. Maybe they actually use some type of like an extraction, method to actually get like, psilocybin containing extract, like a concentrate, which as we, talked about in past episodes, that's generally what they were using in clinical trials. They were actually isolating psilocybin and psilocin into like a concentrate that was happening in a lot of the psilocybin focused, clinical trials. So I had this whole conversation with Felix about, whether there is a full spectrum component of, psilocybin mushrooms. And what we were finding, or what we were, kind of postulating, is that there probably is. There probably is some type of a full spectrum benefit maybe of psilocybin containing mushrooms. And what that means is that it's probably not just the psilocybin that converts into psilocin that affects and modulates our high. There may be terpenes involved, there may be other, alkaloids and other, constituents within the biomass of a mushroom that might impact your experience. And so that really depends on the product that you get. And if you can do this, ask a lot of these questions. Ask a lot of, questions on the origin and the method in which your, products, come to you. And I speak about these things as products just because it comes in different, formats. Whole dried versus powdered, gel, powdered capsules versus a gummy versus a chocolate versus a truffle, all different. I personally do regard, psilocybin mushrooms as more of a spiritual sacrament, but just for the purposes of this conversation, I'm kind of speaking about them as products. And then this is also just another shout out to Miraculix, for the work that they're doing, because they have also created basically like potency tests for psilocybin, containing mushrooms. So if you maybe, let's say, have had mushrooms for a while, you've had it tucked away for a year, and you were curious about, have my mushrooms gone bad? Do they still have efficacy? Then testing for the potency of your mushrooms are really important, especially as it comes to gummies and chocolate bars. What I find is that not every dose, I think, in a chocolate bar is homogenous. It depends on how they're mixing it. It depends on how they're, formulating like that product. So I would be massively curious to see if there was a huge variance, across like one end of a chocolate bar, like to another. In general, I probably would trust that if somebody went through the trouble of making a chocolate bar or a gummy or something like that, that they have their process like dialed in, but you never know out there. And I really invite folks to, look at the Miraculix site and maybe check out their Q tests where they have the ability to, test for the potency across a range of products and across a range of psychedelics. But here specifically, we're talking about psilocybin containing mushrooms. So just wanted to point out those resources as we're, like talking through, some of these things. And so, as it relates to like what strain to use, I would just point folks, we have a lot of content out there on our blog about, the best mushroom strains for, therapeutic purposes and things like that. I will say that strain use unfortunately does have to be relegated to like anecdotal kind of reports. I think that it's going to take a lot more like study and information for folks to be able to like discern like, okay, this type of mushroom strain is great for trauma processing, let's say. This mushroom strain is great for an intro, to altered states of consciousness via psychedelics, which, we can kind of guess on an anecdotal standpoint. Like golden teachers tend to be more predictable and maybe like mild, but that's anecdotal, and not everybody is going to have that outcome of experience because you are a unique human with a unique life and range of things going on in that life. And so there's certainly a level of context that happens here, as well. So I'll kind of put I'm not going to go in so far as to like what strains to use. And I will say that that's where I really love what Miraculix is trying to do around their community based research. Like they now have a community portal where people can go and report their anecdotal experiences. And then what they're going to do is they're going to aggregate that and compare it to their own, scientific research in the lab to try to like formulate a little bit more data, around this. There was also, mushroom strain potency competitions and things like that in certain states and areas. So we're certainly moving in a direction where we're getting more information, we're getting more data, and we're getting more anecdotal reports upon, strain usage and, things like that. So let's jump into some of these other questions that we generally get around just the logistics of using mushrooms. So I'll speak a little bit around, storing and, things like that. So as I mentioned, with whole dried intact mushrooms, I I think that storing in a cool, dry place with little to no temperature fluctuation is really, really important. I also think that the container in which you're, storing mushrooms can also be helpful. Like, I would probably pick like a glass jar above anything. The same jars that you would use to like, pickle vegetables or like, those like ball jars with the really good like screw cap, lid. I would probably choose that over like plastic Tupperware or even like a hard plastic, something. And then I would choose all of that over, just like a Ziploc bag. With a Ziploc bag, those are semi-permeable, which means that there is a little bit of crossover, into the environment. So just assuming that your mushrooms are dried and stored properly, what I might do is put it into a Ziploc bag and then into a jar. I think that, might be the best. And then putting it in a place that has just pretty solid like temperature control. This is also pure guesswork from me, but to the degree that I don't expose it to light, I think the better. And I pull this from just my knowledge from the cannabis industry, right? Like one of the ways, I'll back up. So with cannabis, they learned that it wasn't just delta 8 tetrahydrocannabinol, delta 8 THC that was like getting you high. They realized there's a terpene thing, there's other cannabinoids, there's other so on and so forth. I'm guessing that mushrooms will have the same level of study there, right? One of the things that they were finding is that there was this cannabinoid called CBN that was really, really helpful for sleep. And one of the ways that they were able to actually like produce more CBN in certain cannabis profiles was they were exposing it to certain light spectrums. So what that means is that depending on the light that was exposed to the biomass of like, let's say, just like a general like nug of flour, that would actually convert the cannabinoid profile into CBN. So I'm just kind of like deducing that there may be something similar happening with psilocybin. Like I would imagine that if psilocybin was outside in the heat, in the sun all day, that product is likely going to degrade much faster than something that is in a Ziploc bag, stored in a glass jar, tucked away in a cupboard or a cabinet, lock it if you can, for child safety reasons or whatever, in temperate, climate that doesn't have a lot of like highs and lows. I see a lot of people like putting, psilocybin mushrooms in the refrigerator or the freezer. I generally don't recommend this because it's going to add a moisture content, to what you're trying to store. Anytime you're adding a moisture content to it, then I think that you can run into, contamination or, unwanted mold or mildew or like whatnot. I think the only exception here is if you have what's called like a finished product. If you have gummies or if you have let's say a chocolate bar, those are kind of the two examples that I'm using because those products will have other ingredients in there, right? Maybe there's dairy in there. Maybe there's soy in there. Maybe there's, a certain type of gelatin in there to use the gummy. And so if those things degrade and break down or like get, moldy over time, then that could, contaminate, your product or make them go bad, right? So, one of the curious takeaways with Dr. Felix Bly was he said that he had, foraged for mushrooms, just stored it in a lab under certain conditions. 5 or 6 years later, the potency only dropped by 50%. So you would kind of imagine, I don't know if it's a linear thing like this, but you would then imagine that if it's 5 years at 50%, then maybe you're kind of losing on average like 10% of potency like year over year. I'd say that that's pretty good thinking about like storage and like shelf stability and things like that. I don't think that there's many substances and products out there that can last 5 or 6 years and still retain 50% potency. So you're also less likely of getting like wet mushrooms. I think that it's probably standard and best practice for folks to go through a drying and curing process as it relates to like mushroom cultivation. Now, there were some, psychonauts back in the 60s, 70s, namely Terrence McKenna, who had, coined the whole like heroic dose thing, where he's like, he spoke a lot about 5 grams of dried mushrooms, that there were people talking about taking like 7 to 10 or more, maybe 14 grams of like wet mushrooms. These are mushrooms that were like, freshly cultivated without going through a drying process. And, I just bring that up to say that is within the sphere of exploration for folks. But generally, I don't advise it. Like you're not there. There's just a window on how fresh those mushrooms need to be for you to go through a proper experience like that. And unless you're the cultivator, you're likely not going to run into that opportunity. So I think that it makes a lot more sense for folks to have like whole dried intact mushrooms. That's generally the format that you're going to get. So those are just my thoughts on like storage and keeping them fresh and things like that. Again, a potency test like Miraculix would kind of tell you, let's say you did a potency test with the Q test, and then 6 months later you did another potency test just to see what the drop off of potency is for the presence of psilocybin. So a couple other things that I'll mention. Folks talk a lot about microdosing as well, and based on that conversation with Dr. Felix, it kind of changed my mind a little bit on, my normal advice for folks is like, if you can pre-grind and pre-capsulize your microdose, whether on a weekly or like a monthly, basis. But what we're learning from that conversation in those past couple of podcast episodes, which I highly encourage folks to go back and listen to, is that once you start to like grind down the biomass to like fungal matter, it does start to break down a little bit, like faster over time. So I would venture to think that as best as you can, keeping mushrooms in that whole dried intact format is likely the best for mid to long term storage. So like, is it reasonable for somebody to be able to grind you know 67 milligrams of psilocybin containing mushrooms every day? Probably not. But maybe instead of grinding it down for a 6-month supply, you're considering grinding down mushrooms in like a coffee grinder or something else for the week, let's say. And especially with microdosing, you are working in really like small increments, so there's a little bit of a trade-off of having enough like quantity of this substance for you to be able to like do that logistically. But you use this to inform your own decisions on how you want to go about preparing a microdose. When I'm working with clients in a large dose experience, we are doing that grinding process like right before ingestion. Measuring, really, I would refer to like high tech scales. There's like jeweler scales, other different scales that you can find out there. I always recommend a scale that goes out into the thousandths of a decimal point. So that's three numbers after the decimal. So if there's a decimal, there's tenth, hundredth, and thousandth. So I always recommend a scale that goes out into the thousands. There are scientific scales out there, but those are pretty expensive. Those would be ones that you see pretty commonly in dispensaries, like cannabis dispensaries and whatnot. Those scales probably range anywhere from $600 to $1,200, which is like, that's just a lot of money. So most folks are, serving their purposes and their needs by getting like a jeweler scale that you might find on Amazon or elsewhere. Jeweler scale meaning that they usually use it to measure and weigh jewelry. You want to make sure your surfaces are clean. Any instruments that you're using are clean. So, rubbing alcohol, alcohol wipes, prep, things, any surface that you want to use to measure to make sure that you are keeping everything, clean and sterile. And then also you just want to make sure that you're using the tare function, Tare, the tare function. So, let's say I have a scale and I put something on there to measure my actual like biomass. Well, you want to zero that out to make sure that you're reading that function correctly. And then you also just want to make sure that you are in the right setting. So most of these jeweler scales come in like ounces or like DWT, which I forget. I don't use that at all. So I just make sure that I'm on the gram setting. And then if you're on the gram setting and you have a scale that goes out into the thousands, again, 3 decimal points, that's probably going to put you in pretty good shape to get a level of accuracy that you might need. Using a really stable level surface that doesn't have a lot of vibration is also helpful, because especially when you're microdosing, you are dealing with really, really minute measurements. And so, a difference of 25 to 50 milligrams can change the effect that you might be experiencing. And so, a solid, flat, level surface, devoid of any other vibrations or things, in the area is really, really helpful. Sometimes these scales need to be recalibrated as well. So most of these scales will come with like a calibration kit and like some directions on how to recalibrate. If you're not sure, I sometimes like to use two scales side by side so that I can get a measurement on one compared to the other and be like, okay, I'm within range of the dose that I think that I am, measuring for. And so, you're gonna have to play around with that, a little bit. But I find that once folks get into, the practice, this is a little bit of a learned skill. I think that this is really important, especially for microdosing. With large dose experiences, your margin of error is just a little bit more forgiving, right? So, to me, a difference of 3.2 grams of whole dried, whether it's ground down into a powder or not, versus 3.4 grams, pretty negligible difference. I like to think about, the dosage of large dose experiences kind of happening in that quarter gram, again, 250 milligrams or half gram like increments, 500 milligrams, meaning that there are 1,000 milligrams in 1 gram. So I hope that baseline information is helpful. There's a lot of resources out there, online, just by doing some, Google searches, DuckDuckGo searches, YouTube searches, that might be helpful for you. And then the last, kind of body of questions that we get around the logistics of using mushrooms are, the best ways to ingest. So I can't advise and tell you what to do here. What I can do though is just speak about the most common ways that people are consuming and ingesting psilocybin, containing mushrooms. Of which I already mentioned, there's gummies, there's chocolates. That's obviously pretty straightforward. Just do your math on the dosage and act accordingly. I think that my more common, method when I'm working with clients in, a large dose experience is to, grind down the mushroom so that I have like a homogeneous blend, and then putting that into like an herbal tea, a non-caffeinated, herbal tea, maybe adding a little bit of honey or something to that just for like palate, flavor. I find that to be pretty effective because also what we learn in our conversation with Dr. Felix Bly is that psilocybin is pretty heat resistant. It has a high temperature tolerance. So you can add, boiling water, to it, and it'll still like retain the efficacy of, psilocybin. Then we get into some other, options, like for some folks, they don't like drinking a tea. I think that there are some folks who do want to just like eat the mushroom like whole, intact, which like it can be a pretty uncomfortable experience for some folks. Like I try to balance like how palatable, your doses as well. Some folks like it. They like to taste that like earthy, truffly type thing. Dried mushrooms almost have like a popcorn effect, that feeling where like just things get like stuck like in my teeth. And so there certainly is like a carnal primal type of element, to it if you're choosing to eat them like whole and intact. But most people will prepare it in some way. I would avoid putting it into too many capsules, mostly because those capsules are either made of like vegetable glycerin or a meat-based gelatin. So that stuff, if you're taking too many of those capsules, can also cause like upset in your stomach. So just be mindful of like the amount of gelatin that you're consuming. The same thing with like gummies. If you eat too many gummies, it can also potentially like upset, your stomach. So I would probably prefer or err on the side of like grinding, my mushrooms like into a powder. And then I have a couple options in there. I may be making it into a tea. maybe I'm adding a little bit of like honey to it and like kind of making like a little like ball of, concentrated, ground mushrooms that I'm like then like ingesting and eating. Some folks may add ginger root, to this to try to like get ahead of any potential, nausea and things like that. And then there's also this whole other world of this of what folks are called lemon tech. So that's using like lemon and the citric acid to potentially start to break down the biomass and start that theoretically start that process of converting the psilocybin to psilocin outside of your body. Now, some anecdotal reports say that it speeds up the onset time. Some folks do say that it can help with potential, nausea, but the trade-off is that it sometimes increases the potency of the experience. And so there's a school of thought that says that if you just took 1 gram of dried psilocybin mushrooms versus 1 gram that was done via lemon tech, which is, for lack of just a quick explanation, is that you're basically like taking the mushroom content, pouring, a fresh lemon juice over it, and then letting it sit anywhere from what I see anywhere from like 5 to 15 minutes before you are, ingesting it, maybe with a little bit of hot water or something like that. So what they say is because you're starting that conversion process outside of the stomach from psilocybin into psilocin, that it can actually increase the potency of that experience. And for that matter, a lot of folks also report a shortening of the duration of the experience as well. So, as you've heard me say in past episodes, like I take a school of thought on like the less variables, the better, especially if you are new to psychedelic use. But if you are familiar with altered states of consciousness, if you are familiar with microdosing, if you're familiar with the general effects of psilocybin, and I'm like, okay, maybe you can use a basis of comparison to explore something like a lemon tech or, something like that. So, long story short is that there's a lot of different ways to, ingest psilocybin mushrooms. I think it's very contextual based on the form and format of which you're going about things, what you're preparing for a microdose before you start work on a Monday morning would be different than if you are having a recreational experience or if you are having a more therapeutic or facilitated, experience. If you, work with, let's say, a facilitator within our pre-vetted referral network. So I hope that that's helpful. This, general walkthrough of the logistics of using mushrooms. If you all have any follow-ups or questions, you can certainly reach out to us at www.psychedelicpassage.com. We also get pretty active in our Reddit communities and, different, ways of, engaging with folks. So if you have any follow-up, any questions, any feedback, very, very welcome in receiving that. We're always trying to learn, how we can do better in our service and in our, engagement with our community. So thank you for, being here with us. I think before we go, I will read a testimonial from one of our ceremonial programs. This individual said, the facilitator really let me have my own experience. He didn't try to teach or interpret for me. When things got difficult for me, I let him know and he reminded me to breathe and said, "This is the medicine doing its cleansing." This really helped. So thank you to that journeyer. Thank you to that facilitator for doing that really, really sacred work. And thank you, our listener, for being here with us. So I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day or evening or whatever time that you're listening to this. And we look forward to seeing you next time. Thanks.